So we were just talking about morality and emotion. Should we just rewind a sec?
Yeah, let's rewind us.
So one way to think about morality is on analogy with aesthetics. So like if you're talking about musical taste or taste in art, when you talk about a work of art or a band or a song being good, which is an evaluation, it's an evaluative term, good, bad, better, worse. You are not saying that there is some inherent feature of the song that makes it good, because you're very well aware that what you like may differ from what someone else likes. The reasons you give for liking the song might appeal to somebody with similar values, similar aesthetic values in this case, but will be completely say, oh my God, this song was incredible. It was so loud. It was so noisy. It was like a wall of sound. That's a reason for liking it if you're into that kind of music. If you're not, that's awful. That's like a reason for hating it. So a musical number being good or bad is really a function not of the music itself. It's a relation. It's a relation between the music and the listener. And what makes it good or bad is whether the listener is having a positive emotional response. And likewise, I think when you talk about a policy or an event or a trait of character being good or bad, you're also talking about something that's not inherently or objectively good or bad. You're talking about something that's good or bad in relation to the observer, in relation to how it's regarded. So, for example, when we get into political discourse and we find two people finding the very same policy, say redistribution of wealth, to be unbelievably awful, a case of extreme injustice, something completely unfair and unacceptable on the one hand, or something absolutely mandatory, that possession of wealth, say inherited wealth, is completely unfair, completely unacceptable, and therefore governments have a responsibility to redistribute. So the same policy question, should money be taken from those who have more and given to those who have less? The description is the same, you can agree on all the facts, and one sees this as justice, as good, and one sees this as injustice, as bad. So it can't be the act itself, it has to be something in our regard. And the idea behind sentimentalism, which is a name given to this old view associated with people like David Hume in the 18th century, is that the aspect of ourself that generates good and bad in the aesthetic domain, in the domain of food taste, of music taste, but also in the moral domain, is emotion. That in the case of emotions, for art, maybe it's emotions like wonder, curiosity, or interest, or pleasure. In the case of morality, it's emotions like guilt and shame, anger, disgust, contempt, resentment, indignation. But all of these emotions are not just responses to something that's objectively or inherently unfair, unjust, but rather they make something unfair or unjust.
Yeah. So I was curious, have you seen the research study that I don't know if Sapolsky did it, but he cites it in his book, where people had like trash next to them, and the smell of trash made them more like aggressive, or their amygdala had more activation, I guess, and they were put into more of a fear state.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of studies of this kind. I've done some with my collaborators, which is to say my collaborators have done some and I've signed the papers, but there was a study done by Simona Schnall and her colleagues where she used a very sophisticated scientific apparatus called fart spray. And she sprayed fart spray and asked people to answer a questionnaire that had a bunch of moral questions, like how bad would it be if you found a wallet and took the money out of that wallet before returning it on a scale of 1 to 7. most people think that's, not a great thing to do, but it's not genocide. It's not terrible. So maybe on a scale of 1 to 7, the default might be like a 3. But those exposed to the bad smell, even very low levels of it, so people who aren't even conscious of the bad smell, were giving that higher wrongness ratings. And with a then graduate student at my university, Kendall Eskin, and a psychologist named Natalie Kasnick, we ran a study where we gave people a bitter beverage, Swedish bitters, which are kind of very bitter flavoring element that are used in some cocktails. And we asked people to take a sample of that, said that was for one study, and then we gave them a separate study, which was about morality. And we found people who tasted the bitter beverage as compared to a sweet beverage or a neutral beverage like water gave higher wrongness ratings for the very same questions. And then with my colleague, Angelica Seidel, she developed this very clever way of giving an emotion induction through music. So she would play pleasant music or very disturbing sounds, or sometimes she used real life sounds like the sounds of vomiting. And after listening to these different sounds, we could manipulate people's moral judgments. So we played people Japanese noise music, which is quite aversive to most people. To me, it's enjoyable.
Me too, which is really weird.
Yeah, but that goes to the same point. Like, there are going to be individual differences, just as in the moral case, just as in the aesthetic case, you get in the moral case. People respond differently to the same thing. But what does respond here mean? And I think it's these emotional responses that drive it. So a sort of think about this as a flow chart. You're presented with some story about an action, and now you need to answer the question, is this right or wrong? Or how wrong is this? And what you do, I think, is you introspect and you try and measure from the inside, how do I feel about this? We even use that phrase, how do you feel about this? And you ask yourself, you consult your gut. And if it rubs you the wrong way, another phrase we use, you say, I think this is really wrong. This is really terrible. There's a lot of research where people are asked to give reasons. Why do you think it's terrible? And it turns out we're really bad at that. The reasons we give are either completely irrelevant, clearly kind of after the fact, or not even articulate at all. Sometimes people will say, I don't know, I can't say why it's wrong, but it just feels wrong.
Yeah.
And there was a study done by Jonathan Haidt with collaborators, Bjorklund, Haidt, and Murphy, where they gave people scenarios and said, is this wrong? And people would say yes, and then they'd say why. And for each reason they gave, they would come up with something in their story that disqualified it. So they had two stories. One was about a doctor who eats human flesh. And the doctor is a vegetarian. The doctor is a very ethical person. The flesh comes from a recently deceased cadaver, someone who died in a car crash, somebody who doesn't carry any diseases, somebody with no surviving relatives. The flesh is going to go to waste. So the usual reasons for thinking cannibalism is wrong. It doesn't involve killing. It's not going to offend any relatives. Those are disqualified. And then in the more famous case, they ask about consensual incest between two adults. So a brother and sister.
I was just going to ask you about this, actually.
So an infamous case in moral psychology. Brother and sister choose to have sex. They have a really good time. Is it wrong? And they did this at the University of Virginia. And they asked people, is it wrong? Everyone says yes initially. And then they say, why? And the answers are really predictable. They say things like their kids may have birth defects. And here they say, well, they used birth control. He was wearing 3 condoms. He had a vasectomy. She had a hysterectomy. It wasn't her time of the month. They used the rhythm method, and it was oral sex. Still wrong? Yes. It's not the genetic effects that worry people. They say they'll be traumatized. They say, no, they had a really good time. It brought them closer together. The community will be adversely affected. No, they kept it a secret. They're really good at keeping secrets. Nobody ever finds out. It's wrong in the Bible. Well, where exactly in the Bible is that? Is that in the story of Abraham, the father of the Abrahamic religions, who married his half-sister, for instance? Is it there? that God tells us incest is wrong? Is it where Lot chooses to sleep with his 3 daughters? Is that the passage? Maybe you can tell us where in the Bible the injunction against incest is. And of course, these kids who are at the University of Virginia, you know, they may believe, they may be right that there's scriptural basis for this, but they certainly didn't have that in mind.
Yeah.
And they can't come up with that information. So at the end, some people, that 20%, interestingly, shift their attitude. They say, yeah, maybe this case is all right. But 80% stick to their guns and they say, yeah, it's wrong. I can't tell you why. It's just disgusting. And I think that isn't the exceptional case. That's the normal case. We have these knee-jerk reactions. We're very bad at saying why we have them. And for good reason. We can't say why we have the knee-jerk reactions because morality isn't based on reason. Reason can help you get from a basic moral value like killing is wrong to it's wrong that Ted Bundy killed those people. But if you have to use reason to say why killing is wrong, reason gives out. 2,000 years of philosophy have tried to answer a basic question like that. And even the most sophisticated minds who spent careers thinking about this problem can't agree on something as basic as why is killing wrong. So if the best reasoners in history who are thinking about this in totally abstract contexts, who have the benefit of knowing everything about the topic, can't have a good reason, then it certainly goes to follow that you and I can't come up with good reasons. And I think moral judgment is at bottom a gut feeling. We have evolved in conditioned responses to emote, and those things tell us what's right and what's wrong.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting because like when you talk about things like incest, my wife and I talked about it maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we had a very similar. Yeah, no, and we had a very, very similar conversation. Because I had been thinking about it just from the kind of the exact same perspective that you said. You know, protections used, they're both over the age of 18, so they're consenting adults. I mean, like every flaw in the argument that you could possibly pose is taken away, and yet it's still it's so hard to be like, well, I guess it'd be morally okay, you know. And go ahead.
I think, you know, one possible lesson of this is that it's okay view. Mm-hmm. But another possible lesson is to say, no, it's not okay. The fact that we can't come up with reasons for it just puts it on all fours with every other moral judgment. It's no more okay than, you know, eating feces is okay if you learn that it's not unhealthy. The very fact that you find it disgusting is good enough reason not to do it. And I think the very fact that we find certain behaviors repellent, abhorrent, is for us individually good enough reason to avoid them. We don't need to come up with something further. The danger arises when we try to impose our own preferences on others. So just as you don't want to try and, you know, get somebody to have exactly your music taste or exactly your food taste, it would be an imposition to do so. It would be a kind of mistake to do so because it would presume that there is some objective fact of the matter. I think we get into moral trouble when we try and project our values onto others. But we should tolerate that people who have this negative response to incest, say, and one may even be innate, they should live according to their preferences, just as they should eat and listen to music according to their preferences.
Yeah. Yeah, that was gonna be my next question, but you already answered it. So I'm kind of wondering with objective versus subjective morality, or things like free will versus determinism. Do you think it's a very similar reaction for people? Do you think that their response to not liking the fact that determinism might be true?
Yeah, I mean,
might not be true. Do you think that their response? Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say, do you think that their response is just like an emotional response, that they're not able to come to the truth of the matter because of an emotional response?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you read the philosophical work on free will, we're told there are basically three positions. One of them is determinism, determinism or indeterminism. So in some sense, our choices are not up to us, whether they're random chance or part of a deterministic universe. They originate outside of us in ways that are outside of our control. The other view is libertarian free will that says, no, we can be the authors, the original authors of our own action. And then by far the most popular view is compatibilism. And compatibilism says that even though our actions are determined, some of them get to be labeled free. We have this honorific free that we can circle some of those determined actions and say, these ones are special. I think that this description of the positions is extremely misleading. It's a bit of sophistry. And the reason for that is determinism, hard determinism, indeterminism, and libertarian free will are metaphysical views. They're views about the causal structure of the universe. Compatibilism is not. It doesn't belong with these other views. It's merely verbal. You're admitting metaphysically determinism is true. It's not a compromise between libertarian free will and determinism. You're not getting both of those. You're just straight up determinist who says, oh, the world is determined, but I want to label some of these determined actions free. And I think there are certain reasons, like for the law, for determining where a locus of intervention might be most effective for doing so. Like if you discover that certain actions have in the causal chain certain kinds of psychological states and other actions have in the causal chain other kinds of psychological states, and you want to impact action, then knowing that difference tells you where to intervene. Perfectly legitimate project. But the truth is, the reason why most people are compatibilists is emotion. They don't like the idea that what action is determined. They don't want to admit this. We're so attached to the notion of freedom, especially here in the West, that giving up on that seems like an affront to human dignity. And it's also hard work, because if we give up on that, certain institutions of criminal justice, even day-to-day praise and blame, those things need to be revised. We can't give the credit we give for somebody whose achievements depend in large part on circumstance. We can't incarcerate people and throw away the key for crimes that were in large part a consequence of, say, socioeconomic circumstances. Even polarization politically, like our contempt for members of our political opposition, is naive insofar as it forgets that if we had been born one town over, or it had a slightly different, biography growing up, we'd be voting with equal conviction for the other side. And if you don't have the humility to realize that your own preferences are a function of factors outside of your control, you'll end up blaming people for views that could equally have been your own.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before I ever even thought about free will or determinism, I've always had this belief that if you were born someone else, you would do the same things they do. I mean, it's a little bit more complex than the way I just worded it, but I think that because of religion, maybe, I don't know, but people think the mind is separate than the body, and so they think like, no, if I was born as that person, I wouldn't do that thing. Like if I was born as Jeffrey Dahmer, I wouldn't want to eat someone's penis. It's interesting because I understand the arguments that people like Dan Dennett make, which is essentially the criminal justice system. And, people, if they don't think that they're the arbiters of their destiny, then they might go around killing people or whatever. But that's kind of the same arguments people make about religion. It's like, if people don't think that there's a God, then how are they going to be moral? And it's like, well, I don't think there's a God and I'm moral. I also don't think that there's free will and I am moral. But I think that if people want to switch over to this way of thinking, they might actually have a better argument for morality, because you can start to have more empathy for people that are born into harsher circumstances. There's not like this like big grand pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality that comes with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea that we need some special external justification for being moral is just not true to how we actually engage in that kind of decision making. So, I mean, you mentioned empathy. If you see somebody in need asking for change on the street, and you have some change in your pocket and you choose to give it to them, it's probably not because you sort of have this thought, oh, God is telling me to do this. There's a little angel on my shoulder saying, you better do this now, lest you experience eternal hellfire. Or worse still, you better do this for your entry ticket to heaven. And that's not even a coherent position, because if you're doing it for that kind of self-interest, you won't get to heaven anyway. So even from a theological point of view, you need to do it because you see it as right. You need to do it because you want to do it. And this gets back to preference. Do you want to live in a world where people are kind to each other? Some instrumental reasoning might be involved, like if I were in that person's position, I'd want people to help me, and I want to help collectively build a society where we're good to each other. That happens, that's legitimate. But in the moment, a lot of it is like, I feel for this person. They're suffering, and I can make them suffer a little bit less for this one moment. And that's something I value. That's something I want. So I do think the actual psychology of kindness is not one that requires a big overarching theory of an objective moral realm. Just as food preference or music preference doesn't route through, oh, I like this music because it's objectively the best music in the world. It's enough that you like it.
Yeah. So do you think, Alex Rosenberg has this idea that someday we're going to be able to understand the mechanism of the universe to a point, potentially, as long as we live this long, where we'd be able to just by using calculations determine how the outcome of someone's life could be. What do you think about that?
No. I mean, I think Alex and I are both I would say science enthusiasts, but I think he's more optimistic about science than I am in a lot of respects. I mean, first of all, when it comes to physics, if you look at how many unknowns there are in physics, and I'm not even just talking about like dark matter, dark energy, the standard theory of the basic, the elementary particles is probably incomplete. We don't have, account of where gravity comes from. There's so many unknowns. I mean, is it the Big Bang or the Big Bounce? Pretty much all of the big questions in both cosmology and particle physics remain unsettled. There's been progress, but when you see how much we don't know, it's quite humbling. But take something just like fluid dynamics. Like, there are just questions about the level of order in a complex chaotic system that are still beyond our grasp. So if you think about something as complex as a human life, think about an organism as complex as the brain, think about an external scaffolding as complex as a human society, and try and imagine what would be involved in modeling or calculating what any item within that system is going to do. The model itself would have to have the complexity of the system or something very close to it. And to model it, we'd also have to know so much more about the laws of nature than we currently do. The hope that we'll one day get there is in some way buffered by the fact that we do make advances in our science. But some of these big questions in physics have been glaring at us for decades, and we've not moved forward. And I think that we need to recognize that there may be things for which we'll always experience what philosophers of science call underdetermination of theory by data. We're not going to observe enough. So we have beautifully rich, detailed photographs of the universe. And then the question is, what could explain that scattering pattern, that distribution of matter in the world? And the answer is hundreds, maybe infinitely many different theories could explain that distribution. And as we stand right now, there's no observation that we've come up with that could decide between those theories. So the idea that we might end up in this position forever, that we'll never get to a point where we have a full model of physical reality is, I think that that's probably the best inference from the past that we can make. And it limits us. I do think we can get far in understanding human behavior. But if you look at real cases, like, well, we know that, say, socioeconomic status has a big impact on whether someone, say, becomes a drug user. But are we ever going to get that to a law where we find which ones do? If you have a gene for alcoholism, there's a 14%, if your parents are alcoholics, there's a 14% chance that you'll be alcoholic. There is, in our society, that changes culture by culture, economic status by economic status, ethnicity by ethnicity, sex by sex. But suppose we know all those details. And now we need to decide, is this person going to be in that 14%? Or is this person going to be in the 86%? We don't know the answer. And we can get better. Maybe we can approach the answer to a point where our predictions reach some reasonably high level. But I don't think we're going to approach anything close to asymptotically. I think we're always going to be dealing with a multifactorial problem whose variables are too open-ended to ever predict human action in any reliable way.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a pretty, I mean, I just think that the amount of data that you'd have to know is just insane. But I really like pretty much everything Alex says. And I even like the idea of that. You know, I feel like if there was a way that you could collect all the data, then he might be right. But it just seems like it'd be
yeah, I mean, that's, of course, it wouldn't be worth doing for lots of reasons. But the key philosophical point, in principle, that's the kind of thing we could. It's sort of the end of inquiry. We could imagine that human behavior is such that it is a function of the entire causal history leading up to it. So if we could, in some way, measure that history, we would get a perfect purchase on what somebody was going to do. Modulo indeterminism, because of course we're still at a point where we don't really know how much kind of quantum indeterminacy scales up to the macro scale.
So do you think a lot about, I'm sure you do, this is kind of a silly question, but do you think a lot about like the origin story of the universe? Or do you focus more on consciousness?
I definitely focus more on consciousness in my own work. I think the origin story, I mean, I think that's an area where the experts are so divided. You can take a majority opinion. So right now, most physicists, I would say, most at least Western world physicists believe in inflation. They believe in cosmic inflation, that just after the Big Bang, there was an accelerated period. But there are some really impressive naysayers who reject inflation. It's a minority view, but should we do this by head count? As a non-expert, you want to defer to the experts, and head count seems like a good way of doing it. But you know, when you start to do the sociology of science and say, why is there that consensus? Is it that all these people are sort of exposed to the same information, and when you get 100 rational minds exposed to the same information, 80 choose this? Or is the process not entirely rational? Is some of it a function of who's teaching who's getting positions in the most prestigious universities? If people who believe in inflation are holding the high perceived positions and the gatekeepers for entry into the profession, you could get an expanded consensus that doesn't reflect what the evidence shows. So I think as an outsider, the best we can do is say on origin questions, the court is very much still out. The question of whether origin is even the right word for the universe. If you have a view like the Big Bang bounce view, where there, the infinite extension of time is a real possibility. I think those are exciting questions. They're questions for which speculation is our only guide right now. Grounded speculation, and for which a sideline observer can only sort of marvel without taking too strong a stance. Consciousness, on the other hand, I think is a relatively easy problem. I think it's one for which conclusive theories can be
I do
advanced.
too. I think it's so weird that everybody thinks that consciousness is this, like, I mean, and I'm not a professional. I don't even have, a degree. So it's like really silly of me to think this, but I consciousness to me seems like it shouldn't be that difficult. Like I understand that it'd be difficult to map or to rebuild, but the idea that it's anything more than just processes in the brain and the body, like Antonio Damasio's work, I'm sure you're familiar with that. And people like you and Robert Sapolsky, it doesn't seem like it's that mysterious to me. I mean, it's mysterious, but it's not that mysterious. Like Lawrence Krauss even says that thinks it's like the most mysterious thing that there is. And I'm like, dude, you're a physicist. Like, don't you think that the pre-Big Bang or whatever might be a little bit more, I don't know. I mean, I can lose sleep on what happened before the Big Bang. I can lose sleep on that every night of the week for a year. Consciousness, it's really complicated, and I understand the confusion of it, but I don't know. It just doesn't seem like it's this insane problem that we're never going to understand, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the problem of consciousness can be approached in two steps. And the first step is just simple correlations. You figure out what goes on in the brain when people are conscious as compared to when they're unconscious. That's incredibly easy to do. It's not a settled question, but you can pretty much find conditions like mass priming conditions where somebody is presented with a stimulus followed by a noise screen. They don't see the stimulus. They can't tell you what it is. They show no signs of seeing the difference between that and the case where there's no stimulus, but the stimulus has been processed by the brain. So that's a case of unconscious perception. Then take a case of conscious perception where somebody says, yep, there it is. I see it clearly. I can report it. I can tell you anything about it. Look at the difference in the brain in those two conditions, and now you have a correlative consciousness. That's an ongoing research program. I think that program is maybe not quite at finality, but we have very, very detailed, concrete models of what the difference is there. And it's observational. We can measure that. That's step one. Everyone agrees that's the easy step. Then the hard step is explaining why this neural story we come up with doesn't seem to fit or explain the qualitative character of experience. But for that, there are also really easy answers. Philosophers have come up with answers for decades that explain why consciousness seems puzzling. The seeming there is the crucial word, because the point of these analyses is that it's only an illusion. Not consciousness itself. I think consciousness is not an illusion, but the sense that this experience cannot be a brain state, that's an illusion. And if you can come up with some account of why the way experience feels to us from the first person and the way it seems to us when described in the third person language of science, then you're done. So first figure out what the correlates are, now see why the correlates don't look like they explain consciousness, and you're done. I think that there are really good answers to both those questions. And I think because of that, we basically are at a position where we can say the problem of consciousness is solved or close to being solved. Physics is a whole other story. Even getting your head around some, of the basics of quantum theory. I mean, in some ways, the textbook approach to particle physics is just throw math at it because explanation is never going to come. Like, to make sense, get your head around this. You mentioned the origin of the universe. you put it, what's before the Big Bang? That's something that's incomprehensible. Like that question is just something about which we can never have full comprehension. So I think we're in a position of, in principle, incomprehension when it comes to physics. Something as basic as emptiness. Why, when you look at smaller and smaller magnitudes, you start to see all this space between particles. Something, as basic as the Heisenberg idea that measurement, collapses the wave function. These things are like so fundamentally puzzling that progress in those areas seems, I think, much less likely to come than progress in consciousness studies.
Yeah. When I think about like just even how light interacts, I mean that I can lose sleep about. I mean, it just I if you listen to my discussion with Alex Rosenberg, there's one question that I could never ask him, and I can't ever even think of how to pose the question, but it's basically, why are we here? And that's the question that every philosopher's asked for, ever. And but it's just like, I still try to think about it every day, and I still have never made any ground on it for my own perception. Like, I don't think that I'm like a moral nihilist. I don't really see how there's any purpose or anything like that. And did I glitch out on you?
You glitched a bit, but we're back. Yeah, I mean, am I still with you?
Yeah. You're still with me.
Okay. I mean, so I first of all, I listened to your podcast with Alex, which I loved, and I thought his answer was gorgeous. And he immediately pegged you as a nihilist, and the answer he gave was really about addressing nihilism. I think that was a great response. I love your question too. I have a slightly different sort of strategy for thinking about questions like that. I once gave a talk here at the University of North Carolina at a sorority. They asked me to give an evening talk. They asked me to give it was a dinner time inspirational or motivational speech is what they asked for, which was definitely way outside my pay grade. So I thought I'd talk about the meaning of life. But the thesis of that talk was that actually the problem is not the meaning of life, that's an easy problem. The problem is meaninglessness. And so here's what I said. So on some notion of meaning, if you ask questions, why are we here? Why do we do what we do? There's a very, very straightforward answer, which is maybe connected to evolution, maybe connected to something, but you tell a story about our behavior has final goals. It has things towards which we strive. So more often than not, what we're doing in the course of a day is to eat, is to pay the rent, is to mate. We constantly are engaged in activities that are incredibly practical. In advanced post-industrial societies, they're very indirect. We're not hunting for food, but we're going to the office in the morning to get our paycheck to buy the food. So everything we do is all too meaningful, all too functional. And in a way, that makes human life a lot like life of other organisms. Everything makes sense once you see that this is just a metabolic process. We're just a big carapace for a bunch of genes that are trying to procreate, and all of our activities can be sort of so interpreted. The thing is that as human beings, we have this gift. We have this special ability to do things that are not instrumental, that are not functional. And I think because of that, we should put much more energy into asking the question, how do we bring that meaninglessness into our life in interesting ways? What is the nature of meaninglessness? How do we harness that? André Gide, the famous French author, has this novel called, in French, it's Les Cas du Vatican, but I think it's Lafcadio's Adventures in English. And it's about this kind of quirky character who's obsessed with what he calls the gratuitous act, the acte gratuit. He says human action is always driven by a motive. And how do you cut the connection between motive and act in a way that's completely free? So he tries to do things that are arbitrary, that are out of character, that are absurd. And I think that's kind of beautiful. I think a lot of human activity, like making art, maybe doing philosophy, is in that way impractical. Ways, in another sense of meaning, is by acting in these meaningless ways. So rather than angsting about how our life may have no purpose, maybe we should angst more about how so much of our living day is spent doing things that are purposive, and how we need to make more room for the things that are not.
That is a really cool answer. Yeah, I don't know. I've been like struggling pretty hard with depression for like, I don't know, maybe 6 months. I'm not like a depressed person where I can't like get that, but just struggling with how to cope with meaninglessness, I guess. And so I've been trying to like do all these things that I find interesting and whatever. But I think that, you know, like when you see all of the struggle in the universe between animals and humans and the planet and what we're doing to the planet and our elected officials and all these things, it's like really hard to be like, okay, so we're only here for 100 years if we're lucky, and we still want to kill each other. You know, I don't get it. Like, I don't know. It's just, it's not really a question. It's just like, I just feel lost most days, you know, when I think about all of that. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I am a lifelong depressive, so I wish I had a cure. I wish gratuitous acts were the cure. I do think setting goalposts for yourself is a formula for kind of enduring misery, in the sense that if you don't meet those goals, you feel disappointed in yourself. If you do, you're kind of like, what for? Why did I bother? What is the meaning of this? Does it really have any value? I do think people whose lives involve giving, like I know you do a lot of volunteer work and doing things where you're able to help others, those are cases where achieving the goal or even working towards the goal does feel pretty good. And maybe that's one of the best things we can do for self-care, is care for others. But I think there is a sense in which self-care also involves sort of going easy on ourselves. So my former colleague here, Susan Wolf, has a very fascinating paper on the meaning of life, where she says the meaning of life comes from value and doing what you value. And that can be doing something artistic, it can mean doing something moral, but I think that's too demanding. And in a certain way, it's too elitist. Her contrast case, a life lacking meaning, is the couch potato, somebody who sits around, like streaming videos, and I guess I want to say that we should be less hard on those whose lives are not so valuable by these lofty standards. And if you spend, I think it's easy to get into a cycle, and with the quarantines that are going on, a lot of people are facing this right now, where you find yourself having days that blend into each other, where you're doing nothing, achieving nothing, accomplishing nothing. Hours go by where you're just consuming whatever it is you do, or sleeping in, and we get, to a point where we feel guilty, we're really hard on ourselves, we're judgmental about others. But I think once we recognize meaninglessness in a certain way, once we recognize there's no grand purpose, those are all forms of life. They're all ways of being in the world. They're all forms of self-care. And there's no reason to think that those modes of existence are, have less integrity, less value than those that are more productive. The whole concept of productivity, this kind of quasi-capitalist idea that the worth of human existence comes from contribution to labor, is, I think, poisonous at a certain level. And while we don't want to participate in the rapid destruction of humanity or the universe, doing things that are more passive, and this comes also in some Eastern religions that talk about sort of, acquiescence to the flow of things and the interconnectedness of things, stopping to smell the flowers, meditation, giving up on urges or goals. All that is, I think, constructive in terms of getting us out of a cycle where we engage in a constant sort of self-immolation, because we watch a week go by and we say at the end of it, that waste of time, I really blew that one. Maybe it won't cure depression, but it certainly makes life a little bit easier if we can look back at those weeks and say, I saw some really good YouTubes, I listened to some really good, podcasts during that week. Maybe that's enough.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. I just, you and I exchanged emails, and I asked you the question about, like, is it immoral to, if you're dying of cancer, or if you know that you're going to die from cancer in a year, and your partner's going to suffer through that year and potentially at the end of the year worse than they've ever suffered, is that an immoral act? Because you're basically inflicting suffering on them, and drawing it out and things like that. And I really appreciated your response, because I feel the same way as you do. And your response was that sometimes to have loved is more important, than to avoid suffering, I guess. Kind of summed it up a little weird, but why do you think that, like, suffering comes with the best things? Is there a way to get out of that?
There's a prior question, which is suffering bad? And over the last couple of decades, this subfield of psychology has emerged called positive psychology that tries to measure well-being. And there are a lot of people who've come to think that well-being is more important than, say, economic success, because you can find kind of well-being, and there should be an effort to sort of promote that over all else. But to me, there's no there. There's no that. There is no such thing as well-being. And you can see that by showing that what people regard as a good life varies from culture to culture and from person to person. So in the West, we tend to be very focused on happiness. We want to feel good. But in some parts of the world, including more collectivist societies and some South and East Asian societies, it's not really a matter of feeling good. In fact, you could see that as a negative. You could have the view that there's something self-indulgent and frivolous about happiness, that struggling, that working hard, helping others, being open or receptive to human misery, recognize that it's full of pain, and feeling in some way that you're responsible for registering that with your own state of mind. Those experiences may be, from some perspectives, more valuable, more conducive to a good life than I have this unit. If you have a mindset that says a good human life is a life of complete experience, a life where we recognize the full range of emotions, we recognize life's highs and lows, and also recognize the struggles of others, then to live a life with suffering is to live a life that registers or is in harmony with or respectful of the challenge, the pain of being alive. And if you ask somebody, would you rather have a friend who has a kind of rich emotional palette or somebody who's always sort of chipper and content? I think a lot of people would choose the friend who has the capacity to feel pain, who's sensitive to the pain of others. They're going to feel your pain. And likewise, if you ask about your own life, do you want to be happy all the time? Maybe some people say yes. And I think for those who are really struggling at a particular moment, that might seem like an incredible relief. Misery, the lowest levels are certainly things that most people want to avoid. But I think for me anyway, and I would guess for the majority, having both highs and lows is important. Wittgensteinians had this principle of non-vacuous contrast, and they say there are certain concepts you cannot understand without understanding its opposite. And I think the idea that we can't understand happiness without understanding misery is very intuitive. So we, in emo, we're talking about love and the idea that love and loss are intimately connected, that you can't understand love without understanding the fear of losing someone. If you didn't actually love them, if you didn't actually fear losing them, it could be said you didn't actually love them. Even love and anger, you get frustrated, you're disappointed when a loved one lets you down in a very different way. You're hurt more than if a stranger does or an acquaintance does. So love comes with all of these negative emotions. It might come with jealousy. And I think that it's important to see these emotions not as the dark side or some negative sort of side effects, but it's somehow integral, that loving somebody is in part being disposed to be disappointed when they disrespect you, worried that you might lose them, sad when you are separated. That's what it is to be in love. So to me, suffering too is part of this picture. And the idea that the best things in life also come with some of the worst things is in part a recognition of the fact that things of value are all ephemeral. In Eastern thought, especially in some Buddhist traditions like Zen, impermanence is a very central concept. There's even in Japanese aesthetics impermanence. Japanese flower arrangement, or ikebana, always includes something that is a symbol of decay, maybe one dry flower, because that tells you that this beauty that you appreciate is not going to last forever. And the appreciation of beauty itself depends on simultaneously seeing that. And I think there's something very important about that lesson for all of us. We can't cherish this moment if we treat it as eternal. There's a philosophical debate about immortality. And one of the questions that arise in that debate is immortality a good? And the skeptic is going to say, no, because life that goes on forever would lose meaning. It would lose value. It would be boring, for one thing. But also, how do we really cherish this moment when we think that we're going to go on forever and can keep having other moments like it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I've definitely thought about that too. And I have come to the conclusion that pretty much anybody that really, like you said, is skeptical about immortality comes to that same kind of an answer. However, I always wonder if someone said at 100 years old, do you want to give it out another 100 years? If they would choose that. And then they go 100 years, and then they're like, what about now? Do you want to give it another 100 years? And then they would go with another 100 years. You know what I'm saying? Because it seems like we all, maybe that's our way of coping with death, is trying to find the beauty in it, which I lost my dog like 6 months ago, and that was definitely the like the beginning of this huge depressive state. And it was the hardest thing I've ever gone through, and I've lost some really close people to me. But this dog got me through. I used to have a drug addiction and all of these, problems, I guess. And getting this dog like helped me through a bunch of that stuff. And so losing him, I was like, I feel like I lost a part of myself. And so I don't know, it's interesting. Like I, I mean, I cried for months, you know, and losing him was like this really like rude awakening of, oh my God, I'm gonna lose my wife Kendra, you know, who's totally amazing, and my dad or whatever, and maybe you someday, and it's just weird, you know, it's just this weird thing where it's like I have this really cool relationship with Kendra. I feel like I'm really lucky to have met her, and not a lot of people get to experience that, like a relationship just like, you know, where it's pure love, you know, like we just have always been really stoked about each other, and so we're really lucky in that way. And you know, I'm sure that there are a lot of people, but there's some people that don't get to experience that. And so, but man, losing her, I just hope I go first, but losing her just seems like that's going to be a torturous event, you know? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think coming at that question from an experience of a recent loss,
Yeah.
where that's, you know, very much, and it'll always be with you, but when that's still something you're mourning, you know, makes that very vivid. On the other hand, you know, hearing you talk about your dog and the way your dog was there for you and supported you and got you through, that appreciation, that love, and that recognition, and I think the recognition of your dog's personhood, because I think dogs are among the few animals who really are people, you know, is so important. That's part of your biography now. It's part of your journey. It's something you've learned. It's something that you will impart to others. And it's not that it took the loss to see that. You'd seen it already. But if you weren't in possession of that recognition, you wouldn't experience the loss. And what that says is that the loss is, again, integral to the love. And, you know, I think when you're in the context of a relationship with somebody who's alive, as long as that anxiety doesn't become kind of overpowering and start to infiltrate the relationship, it is a beautiful thing. It's a celebration of the relationship. And I think there's nothing, you know, more meaningful to a partner than to hear, you know, I would be, you know, a lost soul. I couldn't imagine going on in the world without you. I think, to me, if you can be lucky enough to have those relationships in your life, then you've already, you know, lived well. As to the question of 100 more years, you know, if somebody said to you, Eric, you know, today said you know, this is the end of days. We've just, you know, discovered that the virus is going to be universal and it's going to take us all. I think to be able to say, I've lived and loved. Even I've lived, lost, and loved. Even I've lived, lost, suffered, and loved. That you've wrestled with addiction. All of those things are part of what allows you to face the end and say, you know, I've lived fully, I've lived well, I've conquered some demons, I've continued to wrestle with others. My life is incomplete. There's more I want to do. There's more I could do. But no one can say I haven't lived. And that sense of fullness, I think, allows us to face finality in a very different way than we would having been sheltered, having experienced nothing but contentment.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So I have two more questions. I'm already like taking too much of your time, but I have two more questions. Um, well, okay, one's a statement that I thought was kind of funny the other day. You might just get a kick out of this because it just shows how flawed our thinking can be. But the other day I was, I think I was hiking, and I was thinking about consciousness, and I just kept on like getting in this loop of thinking, okay, so consciousness arises at the brain, but maybe once I'm dead, and there will be another brain where my consciousness will arise at, And I was like, I just started getting in this loop of thinking about basically reincarnation. And I was like trying to like explain to myself that that doesn't make any sense. And I don't know, I just started laughing because I just could not wrap my head around it. So I guess there are weird problems with consciousness that I still, even though I try to be pretty pragmatic about it, it still troubles me,
I think there are. Descartes is most famous for saying, René Descartes is most famous for saying, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, which is a way of articulating the idea that you, in thinking, register your own existence. And I think one corollary of that is that we can't really imagine our own existence. So death is imponderable in the sense that as soon as you're engaged in an act of imagination, you are imagining being alive. So, so there is something weird about immortality, but I actually think there is an illusion that goes on here. There's a famous thought experiment by the philosopher Bernard Williams where he says he's trying to refute the view that personal identity is connected to memory. So people like John Locke inspired a very popular line of view according to which I am my biography. I am the set of memory links that connect me back to previous stages in my life. And Williams wanted to challenge the view, and he said, well, imagine you're captured by an evil scientist, and the evil scientist says, I'm going to first erase all of your memories, and then I'm going to torture you. If Locke were right, if John Locke were right, you should say, well, I'm really worried about the erasure of my memory. That will be my death. That's the end of me. I am my memories. But the torture, who cares about that? That will be somebody else. That's not me. And Bernard Williams invites us to have the thought that, no, we would dread that torture. We'd be like, that's insult to injury. You're going to first take my memories and then you're going to make me feel pain. And I think everyone sort of shares that. There's, you can show asking the question as a kind of experimental philosophy probe, people think that they would still exist after their memories were gone. And maybe they're right, but I think the illusion is that we think that the self and we think that consciousness is some kind of atomic point that's dissociable from all the contents of consciousness, our beliefs, our values, our human connections to other individuals, that we could kind of exist after all this stuff is severed, even that we do exist as a single person over the lifespan as all this content changes. I think that's an illusion. So I think we, because of this Cartesian idea, this Descartes idea that every time we think about thinking, we think that's the I, that's me, I exist there in that single atomic unit of thought. That idea is so seductive that we lose track of the fact that when we look for ourself and experience, you think, okay, I'm going to try and like get into contact with Eric right here and now. How do we do that? You think about who you love, you think about what you care about, what you enjoy, your pastimes. You might think about some past experience. You think about your plans, you think about your values, you think about your emotional temperament and dispositions, your moods, your preferences. It's all that content. And I think that for human life to be cut off from that, like a human life that would say continue so long that the relationships you have in your life change, that the historical facts that make up your biography change. Think about something as simple as there's a debate right now about whether Joe Biden has evolved morally, because his position on things like LGBT issues and mass incarceration, to a certain extent healthcare, these things seem to be changing. Gay marriage, he was against. He changed on that. Hyde Amendment changed on that. So, so is he evolving? We all evolve. And I think as we evolve, it's kind of a transformation. We become different people. So the self isn't a fixed entity that lasts as long as a biographical life. It certainly wouldn't last the duration of a 200-year life or an infinite life. So when we start getting ourselves into this mindset of immortality, it's because we've tricked ourselves into reducing the I to this moment of experience and thinking that's us. But it's not. That moment of experience is a universal. Anyone, a content-free moment of experience would be exactly the same, or very, very similar for most human beings. The thing that makes your life yours is all the other stuff. So I think we're prone to a pattern of thinking that gives us an attachment to life that's based on the false belief that there is one biographical self that inhabits this body through a lifespan. Once we see ourselves as ephemeral, as fleeting, as impermanent, then we realize death is an ongoing process, usually with rebirth. Reincarnation is an event in terrestrial life, and we've all been through multiple lifetimes by the time we got here, and we'll be through many more. So at the end of our days, the continuation, the thought of a continuation is a fiction, an imagination that we project onto the world, but could have no basis in how human life actually works.
Yeah, that's also awesome. I feel like I could chop this conversation into a million pieces and it'd be worth pushing into the ethos. So one more question, and I don't know how you want to talk about this, or if you want to talk about this. If not, that's fine. But have you researched psychedelics at all, and consciousness, and if you don't want to answer this either, have you done psychedelics and stuff? So
I think I'll avoid the last question, but cool. I mean, I do think can you understand a phenomenon by looking at its exceptions? And I think the answer is yes. And I do think psychedelics have a lot to teach us. But I think another thing about psychedelics is that metaphors like mind expanding, like they give us kinds of experience that we cannot have otherwise, is a source of value. I mean, you might just as we talked about the richness of emotional experience, the richness of perceptual experience, of intellectual experience, all those things add to a good life. Right now, there is an ayahuasca trend, and a lot of people are saying this is really transformative. Having an ayahuasca experience is life-changing. It can cure depression. It can create more intimate relationships between people. I think a lot of that is not from the drug alone, but from a lot of the trappings, a lot of the way we think about the drug, and the sort of cultural mythos behind the drug. But I do think making yourself receptive to getting outside of your usual flow of experience, which is so routinized, is immensely valuable. I've been thinking too a lot about psychosis, and I think for those, we often treat mental illness as something to be cured. And what we forget is that, first of all, for the individual who has this kind of experience, it is part of their identity, it's part of who they are. I'm depressive, I don't want to be non-depressed. When depression is debilitating or comes with serious risk of self-harm, that's something that, partially out of concern for loved ones, I want to be mindful of. I mean, that's something we do need to be on guard about. But I don't want to be a happy person. Like, I just don't want that. But so much of our healthcare intervention is focused on...
Sorry, I have to cut you off before you go further, just because I feel like you're the first person that I've met that may have just explained myself. I've never even thought about it like that, because I don't know, like my close family is always I don't want to say pressuring, but they're always like, why do you care so much about all of these kinds of conversations, or why do you get wrapped into political stuff or pay attention to any of that stuff? And don't you think it messes with you, like you don't enjoy life as much or something? And I don't really want to, like, this is like my version of joy, like I really care about what's going on in the world and how people are treating other people, and it pisses me off and it enrages me sometimes, but I like that about myself, and I wouldn't really want to just be different.
We need to do a screen capture of you like in a particularly brooding, like grim moment, and create a meme that says, "This is my version of joy." You know,
Yeah.
I love the idea that we have different ways of feeling at home in ourselves and in our world. And for those of us who are depressed, that is not feeling happy-go-lucky. It is feeling like, that sense that I wouldn't recognize myself. I wouldn't want to be that person. I didn't even want friends like, you know what I mean? Like it's integral. And so to go back to an earlier conversation, we were talking about subjective morality. I think the big trend among atheists these days is to try and say, we can get an objective morality. Here's how we do it. The good is like happiness and well-being, and the bad is suffering. And a universe with the good is a better universe than the universe with the bad. And I think that's just hopeless, because I think that these very terms, what counts as well-being, what counts as good, those are so individually variable and so relative. So for the person who likes suffering and in some sense of that, and maybe not abject misery, but kind of feels like their baseline is down here and they're okay with that. If a moral theory says the world would be morally better if we gave you a pill that made you happier, fuck you. Like that, you say that's a good, to call that morally better. Some philosophers try and fix this by saying what matters is not like the hedon count, how much happiness is in the world, but goal satisfaction. But that's kind of complicated too, because I think, for one thing, we're very bad at setting goals and knowing what's going to make us thrive. Like there's research on what's called affective forecasting. And you ask somebody, what is going to make you happy? It's going to finishing my PhD, or not getting fired, or physical health. And people are very bad at that. They definitely don't have a good sense of what goals they need to meet to live a life that is going to fit their standard of living well. So I think we have to be very, very careful when we start to sort of prescribe what it is that makes for good life, makes for well-being. Coming back to psychotropic drugs, I think that for me, one of the reasons why I've been so interested in mental illness and drugs in general, but also psychedelics, is I think there are modes of existence that are accessible, naturally accessible to some people and not to the rest of us. And the rest of us try so hard to make everyone like us. Like, just as a happy person can't imagine somebody being okay with depression, somebody who hasn't experienced psychosis thinks that that's the worst thing in the world. There's no diagnosis more stigmatizing than being psychotic. And it's very dysfunctional, not because of the behavior intrinsically, because of the mismatch between that way of being in the world and the way we've organized society. So we try to do what we can medically to prevent that from happening. But I think we have a lot to learn from, and are very lucky to have drugs that we can use to experience the world from a perspective that breaks down some of this order that we constantly impose on it in our non-psychotic states. I know a lot of your podcasts have dealt with religion, and I think one of the things that we lose from the atheist camp is a kind of sense of magic, a sense of the wonder of things. The word spiritual is one I've always been a little bit allergic to, but I think something in that ballpark is really important to preserve. And if we think about the fact that the world that we normally experience is an illusion, that solid bodies are an illusion, that goals are somehow, sort of silly and meaningless, that the way we've organized the world is largely constructed. We live in houses, we wear clothing, everything has been manufactured. Even the nature we're exposed to has been manicured. and come to realize that artifice, that illusion, that imagination is already the basis of the world we inhabit. Then we can kind of open our minds a little bit to having mind-altering experiences that break down some of that structure. And we see that as sort of, less real or distorted or losing touch with reality. But all of this is an illusion too. And maybe that's just another purchase, another perspective from which reality can reveal itself. And I think those who sort of talk about the spiritual or magical thinking or nature being imbued with, a special vitality, it sounds hokey, it sounds supernatural, but I think the world is this booming, buzzing confusion that we have pristinely arranged into digestible parts at some expense, some cognitive expense. There's distortion involved in that. And anything we can do to gain an insight into the fact that the world is actually this swarm of interconnected stuff, whether it's doing particle physics or taking a drug that makes boundaries start to, pulsate, those things really do give us a purchase on reality. They are windows into truth. Scientism, in its pejorative, is the view that certain fields of inquiry, the sciences, give us reality as it really is and the rest is an illusion. But science itself is an imposition of categories and structures that are just tidy and useful for our own digestion. And I think ordinary experience is as real. The world of macro physical objects is as real as the world of particle physics. And the world experienced through the filter of psychosis, through the filter of depression, through the filter of mania, of euphoria, and of psychedelic drugs is also a feature of reality. Poetic truth, scientific truth, they're both ways of describing reality. When we think one of these is privilege, when we think a characterization of the way the world is through scientific instrumentation captures something that's more legitimate than a poetic meditation, we're forgetting the fact that each of these things is itself a filter. Each of these things is a mode of description. Each of these things imposes categories. And each of these categories is relational. It's taking us as the lens. It's taking the world as the subject. And it's creating a marriage between them. And because they're both based on those two components, they have equal claim to truth.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you on the religion thing, actually. I grew up religious or in a religious household, I guess, and I became like an atheist when I was 16 or 17. And I went through this really long period of just like totally anti-religion and anti-theist or whatever you want to call it. And then I slowly started to come around where like I see all these problems with losing religion that I don't know if we're quite ready to bridge yet. And I'm sure my atheist friends are going to beat me up over that. But one of them is community. But the other one is exactly what you're saying. And I think the problem is that I think that the universe is so mysterious and so insanely magical when you really think about what it is. I mean, it is insane, incomprehensibly insane. It's way more mysterious and magical than religion could show, I mean, it's just weird. And I love that about it. But sometimes you'll get dry science where it's just like makes it seem a lot more boring than it is. And that's really frustrating because
I love that you said that, because there's a view according to which the lesson of the Enlightenment is that we should give up on wonder, we should give up on magic, that basically all that is just faith and superstition. It's confused, and what science should do is it should clarify, it should illuminate how things are in such a way that all these things that seemed weird and mysterious and magical now look logical and organized and fully transparent to us, fully explainable. But as you say, good science isn't actually like that. Some of it is, but most science that's actually doing its job is dealing with domains that are complex. And when you're dealing with complexity, you're usually discovering that the reality below what Wilfred Sellers called the manifest image, below how we experience things, the scientific purchase on reality, is actually weirder, is stranger, is more magical, more mysterious, more puzzling, more fantastic than the reality of the everyday. And you don't need to get to quantum theory. I mean, the simple idea that this is all a swarm of particles blows my mind. Like that's an amazing, it explains things like that, water boils at a certain point and has all these, is transparent. That can be explained by the science. Descartes wrote a book where he explained the arc of the rainbow using math. And, that's a satisfying explanation. A puzzle has been solved. But in solving the puzzle, we don't just end up with something that sort of gets rid of wonder. We introduce something more wonder. Like
exactly
mathematical order to the universe, like all of that is so mind-bending that I do think we have a capacity in science to sort of perpetuate and expand and deepen our sense of wonder.
Yeah.
Religion too, I agree. Community, I mean, religion is like art. It's one of the great cultural achievements. It's part of how we form our identities. It's part of the fabric of human history. Cultures that are defined around, religious traditions are, one of our greatest achievements. And I think, moments of sort of spiritual feeling, that sense of the world having value, the sense of connectedness, those are all very worthwhile and very real aspects of experience that we should cultivate. And if we can cultivate it through science, that's great. But I think it's a mistake to villainize evil too much, villainize religion too much. So, like Alex Rosenberg says, the two great evils are nationalism and religion. And I think, no, there's one great evil, which is in-group, out-group bigotry, such that you preference your in-group over the out-group to a point where you're willing to harm them. It turns out, when we know this from psychology dating back decades in what's called the minimal group paradigm, you can basically create in-group, out-group thinking around anything. It can be around history, around diet, around wardrobe, around ethnicity.
NFL teams, colors. I mean, yeah. It's
so
crazy.
The fact that religion has been one of the pivots on which that identity formation has hung, and that's sometimes used to justify violence, is something we need to be, reckoning with and work to mitigate. But I don't think that's the fault of religion any more than anything else. You think about sort of the history of human wrongdoing and our capacity to endorse, violent conquest. Is really quite extraordinary. Go back to the 19th century, which was a kind of age of empire. Look at the scramble for Africa. Look at the Napoleonic Wars. Look at the Indian Wars, where over the space of 100 years, the European conquerors of the North and South American continents basically decimated an entire population in many cultures. Those were not largely wars of religion. They were wars of greed, they were wars of conquest, but they did require this distinction between in-group and out-group. Before African people were enslaved, the word slavery itself comes from Slav, because Europeans were enslaving other Europeans. And there are many, many ways we can define in-group, out-group. But once you get that and use that to say, we have the right to decimate members of the out-group, then you get into trouble. I think the place in contemporary kind of policy context where we really feel apprehensive about religion is when we find a religious group trying to impose their preferences on a secular population in a way that's enshrined by law. Likewise, I think we should be kind of a bit worried about the opposite. We should be mindful of the fact that in taking a secular view and making that the law of the land, we might trample on religious toes. And part of the complex challenge of working in a large-scale society. I mean, human beings used to live in very small groups where they could share values, but in a large-scale society, you need to get along with difference. A lot of people on the left have been very, very into, big government, very anti sort of state scale or community scale solutions. And I think that's a mistake. Libertarianism is a right-wing position in America. And the left is almost uniformly in favor of more federal scale solutions. But I think that we should be really open on the left to the idea that actually small groups should be able to self-determine. As long as there's freedom of movement from group to group, if communities can set their own values.
I totally agree with you on this. That's really cool, yeah.
So we need, I mean, in a way, anarchism is like this. It's a libertarianism for the left. But whatever kind of big political umbrella we pick, I think this basic idea that the challenge of a large-scale society is that given our tendency to form these groups, we need to find ways to respect each other and not tread on each other's toes, not try and impose our values on others. If we can find successful ways of doing that, we'll have sort of solved the biggest moral problem. So for those who are worried that religion will step on our toes, let's find ways to all get along so each of us can create our own small utopias.
Yeah, the only problem that I see with something like that is if we do small group things, then do they start to grow and start to overtake other areas and then become kind of in the same situation that we're in right now, I guess? I don't know how a long-term solution for something like that looks, but I do agree with you. One of my friends, Lewis, and I have been talking a lot about localism and just how trying to cut out these huge international corporations that have no interest in the public well-being, so.
We're living in an interesting time, and I think we're seeing a tremendous consolidation of power, of economic power, of political power, on a scale we've never imagined. And the implications of that are enormous and need to be approached with caution. I think if you look, for example, at the rapid growth and enormous wealth of Amazon, of Jeff Bezos, you look at a moment like this where people are living in quarantine and depending more. So I don't want to accuse Bezos of profiteering because the profit model was already in place, but the powerful are getting more powerful right now. The tech companies that have software for doing this, for profit, making profit. And, people, talk about AI coming around the corner. And I think it is. And I think one of the consequences of that is going to be first mass unemployment, because mechanization, automatization, robotization of industry will become pervasive in every sector. And then because mass unemployment is such a destabilizing social force, the tech companies will realize that they actually need to give a universal income to everyone. First of all, to maintain a consumer base, but also just to preserve, social stability. But the trade-off for doing that, the way they're going to sort of accept the burden of taking care of the population who are not working, is by seizing political control. Governments are going to kind of disappear or give power over to these tech conglomerates in a way that's going to, sort of put the world in possession of, the kind of ultra wealthy controllers of technology. You could spin that as a utopian
Can I cut you off
future.
really fast?
Sure.
Yeah. I just want to cut you off. So would there be a potential solution that kind of comes from socialism, where if these huge tech companies do become essentially governments, you could give the public a certain amount of controlling interest so that they can democratize it and make better decisions for the environment and things like that?
I think that's the key. I mean, I do think we, in socialism as it was originally conceived, democracy was a core principle. There were times when anarchism and which is a consensus-based form of government, and a localist-based government was closely allied with socialism. There were deep divisions there, but the two had a lot of overlap. And obviously, having lived through the Cold War, having lived through kind of a Leninist version that's more totalitarian, and the connection between socialism and democracy has been conceptually severed. But I think what we need to be thinking about now is, as power consolidates, how to structurally preserve the voice and the role of community, of individual of people in that process. So if you look at something like the EU, in some ways the EU is a really great thing. And the reason why it's a great thing is it helps with balance of power with China, with Russia, with the United States. If you don't have a powerful European conglomeration, you're in a position of imbalance that can ultimately lead to hegemonic power that's bad for the world. But EU has been a sort of interesting body because it is it's structurally working to preserve the interests of these different nations. It's like, the projects here that the founders had, some of the founders, this was the Federalist, anti-Federalist debate in a way, but do we preserve the preferences, the integrity of the individual states? And I think the European Union is an effort to do that. I think in some versions, the United States was an effort to do that. I think as we face a kind of unforeseen kind of consolidation of political and economic power, we need to be thinking a lot about just these issues. And if we can make sure that the tech companies, who no longer kind of depend on us as voters or consumers because they have absolute power, if they can still listen to us, maybe the kind of dystopian version of this future can be avoided. But that gives us a very concrete and difficult challenge, which is figuring out how to keep our voice in there. And I think a lot of political energy should be spent on that. In a way, we've been delivered a false dichotomy. Those of us who raised in the kind of Cold War mentality, where basically there are two political futures. There's capitalism and there's socialism. Capitalism won, and the little bits of socialism that remain need to be kind of pushed out. I think we need to remember that both of these are really recent inventions, and that the range of political futures is kind of open-ended, and it's up to us, it's another role for philosophy maybe, to figure out different ways to organize society. The world is changing really, really fast. And if we don't sort of stay a step ahead of that and imagining what kind of social organization we want in a world where technology plays the kind of role that it's destined to play, we're going to end up in a very, very bad situation. So we need to be thinking outside of, polarization, Democrats, Republicans, Cold War, socialists, capitalists. Those dichotomies need to be tossed, and we need to be thinking in a much more, future-focused way on political futures that don't fit any of those categories.
Well, I am so stoked that we talked, and I think that it's time to wrap this up because it's been like almost 2 hours, and I could go for another 10 with you, I'm sure. So maybe we should talk again soon. I would love to talk soon. I would really like to go talk to you in person sometime. I think it'd be way cooler.
When that's no longer a health hazard to the globe. We
right.
should celebrate the end of our Corona quarantines.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thanks so much, Jesse. I really appreciate it. It was so good to meet you. And
Likewise,
um,
Eric, it's been really
yeah,
great. Listening to your podcast has been an absolute education. So very great.
that's really honoring to hear come from you. I It's weird because I feel like I'm not like the brightest person in the world, but I feel like over the last 2 years, just reading and taking classes and stuff has changed my perception of understanding. And if you listen, not you, but if someone listens from episode 1 until now, they'll just see this huge change in who I am. I mean, my outlooks on things, how I understand things, and it just kind of goes to show how important reading is. Or, you know.
Well, I think it shows that. It shows too that intelligence isn't an internal trait. Intelligence is a shared social communicative trait. Being intelligent is being in conversation. It's something no one person has, but together we can have a lot of. And sort of
Yeah.
being a conversational format, learning from others, learning from books. I'm sort of surrounded by this shrine of printed matter. And, this notion, Dave Chalmers and Anne Clark have this notion, the extended mind. And one way to think about that is my mind isn't located in my cranium. It's all of this that I can turn when asked and open up a page and answer a question, or do a web browser search and answer a question. Means we have access to all this stuff that makes everyone who is able to read a super intelligent agent. And that none of us are alone, that all thinking is a kind of joint activity.
Well, thank you so much for your contributions, because it's definitely helped me a lot. So
Likewise.
I look forward to our future conversations. All right.
As do I. Keep